They knew the numbers. They knew America was richer. They knew America had more industrial power, more resources, and the ability to build ships and aircraft on a scale Japan could not match. And some Japanese leaders understood something even more frightening. If the war became a long war, Japan probably could not win. So why did they attack? Why would a country deliberately strike a nation that was economically stronger, geographically safer, and capable of producing weapons on a scale Japan could barely imagine? The answer is not simply arrogance, and it is not simply madness. It was a chain of decisions built from fear, desperation, ideology, miscalculation, and one enormous gamble. A gamble that began with a simple question: what happens if Japan waits? To understand Pearl Harbor, we have to forget something for a moment. The story did not begin in Hawaii, and it did not begin on December 7th, 1941. Japan had already been at war in China for years. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria began in 1931. Then, in 1937, the conflict with China expanded into a full-scale war. Japan was building an empire across Asia, and this created a problem. Japan wanted to become a great power. But Japan lacked many of the natural resources needed to sustain a modern industrial and military state. Oil was particularly important. Ships needed it. Aircraft needed it. Tanks needed it. Factories needed it. The Japanese military machine could not simply run forever without secure access to fuel. And much of that fuel came from outside Japan. So Japan's expansion created a vicious cycle. The more territory Japan wanted, the more resources it needed. And the more aggressively Japan expanded, the more resistance it created from other powers, especially the United States. This is where the story becomes much more interesting. Japan didn't suddenly wake up one morning and decide, let's attack America. The relationship deteriorated step by step. The United States opposed Japanese expansion in China and increasingly restricted exports of strategically important materials. Then came the critical problem: oil. By 1941, Japan's leaders understood that their access to fuel was becoming dangerously vulnerable. The United States froze Japanese assets in July 1941, and restrictions on oil followed. Japanese leaders saw the situation as a threat to their ability to continue their war and maintain their empire. Now, put yourself inside the Japanese decision-making room. You have two choices. Option 1, back down. Reduce your ambitions. Withdraw from territories you have already conquered. Accept American demands. Or, option 2, go south. Move toward the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, especially the Dutch East Indies. There was one enormous problem with option 2. Those territories were connected to the interests of Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States. So Japan was approaching a terrifying conclusion. The road to the resources it needed might lead directly into a war with America. And this is where the psychology changes. Japan wasn't simply asking, can we defeat America? The more immediate question was, how long can we survive without the resources we need? That is a very different question. Because if Japan believed that waiting meant its military position would become weaker, then doing nothing was no longer neutral. Doing nothing became a decision too, and Japanese planners were watching American military expansion. The United States was already rearming. Its industrial base was enormous, Its navy was expanding. Its ability to build ships, aircraft, weapons, and ammunition was increasing. Japanese leaders could see the direction of the trend. The longer they waited, the worse the balance might become. So the strategic calculation became brutally simple. If war is coming eventually, is it better to fight now or later? And this is the point where a terrible idea begins to look like a rational option. Not because the idea was actually safe, but because the alternatives appeared dangerous too. And then we meet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was not a man who simply underestimated America. He had spent time in the United States. He understood American society and, importantly, American industrial power. And he understood the danger of a long war. The famous sleeping giant quote is widely attributed to Yamamoto. But there is no reliable historical evidence establishing that he actually said those exact words. Don't use that quote in your documentary as fact. But there is a much more useful historical point. Yamamoto's own warnings about a prolonged war were deeply pessimistic. The National Park Service records that he expected Japan could run wild for roughly 6 months, while expressing serious doubt about what would happen afterward. Think about what that means. The man who would plan the attack was not necessarily saying America is weak. He was effectively saying, if we're going to fight this giant, we have to hit it before it can fully use its strength. That is a completely different mindset, and it leads directly to Pearl Harbor. Japan did not have a realistic plan to conquer the continental United States. That was never the point. The objective was much more complicated. Japan wanted to move south, take resource-rich territories, build a defensive perimeter, and prevent the American Pacific Fleet from immediately destroying that plan. That is why Pearl Harbor mattered. The American Pacific Fleet at Hawaii was a giant obstacle sitting between Japan and its proposed southern expansion. So Yamamoto proposed something extraordinarily risky: destroy or cripple the American Pacific Fleet at the beginning of the war. Then Japan could move rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And while America was recovering, Japan would consolidate its new territory, build defenses, and then, potentially, negotiate. The National Park Service describes Yamamoto's strategic concept in essentially those terms. Damage the American fleet severely enough to allow Japan to consolidate its territorial gains and then seek a negotiated peace. And now the entire strategy comes into focus. Japan wasn't planning, we will destroy America. The gamble was closer to, we will shock America so badly that America may decide the cost of continuing the war is not worth it. And that assumption would prove catastrophic. America was not simply sitting there asleep. This is another myth worth killing. The United States had already been preparing for the possibility of war. The American government had been increasing military production. The military draft had already begun. The Pacific defenses were being strengthened, and American policy toward Japan was becoming increasingly confrontational. So when Japanese planners imagined a devastating first strike, they were making a dangerous assumption. They were assuming that a military defeat at Pearl Harbor might produce a political decision to negotiate. But there was another possible reaction: rage. And they were about to discover the difference. Here's the part that makes the story even more fascinating. Even while military preparations were accelerating, diplomacy had not completely stopped. Japan and the United States were still negotiating. There were attempts to find a settlement, but the central disagreement was enormous. America wanted Japan to reverse much of its expansion. Japan wanted to preserve the strategic position it had built. The two sides were moving toward completely different destinations. And then came November 26th. Secretary of State Cordell Hull presented Japan with the document that became known as the Hull Note. The proposal emphasized principles such as territorial integrity, non-interference, and peaceful relations, and it called for major changes in Japan's position in China and Indochina. From Washington's perspective, this was a proposed basis for settlement. From the perspective of Japan's leaders, it looked increasingly incompatible with the empire they had spent years building. And there was another extraordinary detail. Japan's military preparations were already far advanced. The Japanese task force heading toward Pearl Harbor had already sailed before the final diplomatic exchange was completed. The diplomatic door was not literally non-existent, but the military machine was already moving. Imagine the pressure inside Tokyo. If Japan retreats now, it risks losing what it has already conquered. If Japan waits, the oil problem becomes more dangerous. If Japan moves south, war with America becomes increasingly likely. And if Japan attacks America, it is gambling against the strongest industrial power it has ever faced. There was no good option, only options with different kinds of danger. And this is one of the most important psychological lessons of the entire story. When leaders believe every road leads to disaster, they don't necessarily choose the safest road. Sometimes they choose the road that gives them the illusion of control. Pearl Harbor gave Japan that illusion. Because Japan could choose the moment. Japan could choose the target. Japan could choose the opening move. And for a military leadership under enormous strategic pressure, that control was intoxicating. Before dawn on December the 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft were approaching Hawaii. The American Pacific Fleet was sitting at Pearl Harbor. The attack was designed to achieve surprise, and it did. The first wave hit. Aircraft attacked battleships and airfields. The scale of destruction was enormous. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. American aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. The Japanese attack inflicted severe damage on the Pacific Fleet. For a few hours, the Japanese gamble looked brilliant. But then came the detail that would haunt the strategy. The American aircraft carriers were not in the harbor. They survived. And the Japanese attack also left major shore facilities, including fuel storage and repair facilities, largely intact. This matters enormously, because the purpose of Pearl Harbor was not simply to create explosions, it was to create strategic paralysis. And the American Pacific Fleet was wounded, but not strategically destroyed. And now we reach the moment that changes the entire story. Japan had successfully shocked America. But what had the attack actually achieved? The battleships were damaged, but the carriers survived. The fuel infrastructure survived. The repair facilities survived. And most importantly, America did not ask for peace. America declared war. The attack that Japan hoped would buy time instead helped unite American public opinion behind a total war effort. This is the great irony of Pearl Harbor. Japan wanted to buy time, but the attack gave America a reason to use its enormous industrial power with virtually no political ambiguity. The giant was no longer being debated. It was mobilizing. So now we can finally answer the question from the title. Japan knew America was stronger. Yes, at least some of Japan's most important military leaders understood that clearly. But they made a different calculation. They believed that American strength could be delayed. They believed a devastating first strike could cripple the Pacific Fleet. They believed rapid Japanese victories could create a defensive perimeter. And they hoped that the United States might eventually accept a negotiated settlement rather than fight an enormously expensive war to reverse Japan's conquests. That was the gamble. But the gamble contained a hidden assumption. It assumed America would think the way Japan expected America to think. And that was the fatal mistake. Look at the sequence one more time. Japan expands. America reacts. Japan feels increasingly threatened. America increases pressure. Japan sees retreat as dangerous. So Japan expands again. America responds again. And eventually, each side's attempt to improve its security makes the other side feel less secure. That is how strategic traps work. Nobody has to believe they are choosing disaster. They only have to believe that the alternative is worse. Japan didn't need to believe we can beat America in a 10-year industrial war. It only needed to believe we may not survive if we wait. And once that belief became dominant, Pearl Harbor stopped looking like an insane first move. It started looking like a desperate exit. The problem was, it wasn't an exit. It was the entrance to a war Japan could not control. So, why did Japan attack America? Not because Japan believed America was weak. Not because every Japanese leader thought victory was guaranteed. And not because they had a realistic plan to conquer the United States. They attacked because Japanese leaders increasingly saw themselves trapped between two terrifying possibilities: retreat and lose their strategic position, or fight now, before America's full power could be brought to bear. Pearl Harbor was therefore not the opening move of a war Japan expected to win through industrial strength. It was a gamble to win through speed, shock, and political calculation. And for a brief moment, it worked. But Japan had made one fatal mistake. They had calculated the power of America's military. They had calculated the number of ships. They had calculated aircraft. They had calculated fuel. They had calculated time. What they failed to calculate was what America would become after Pearl Harbor. Because America did not respond by asking for peace. It responded by mobilizing. And once that happened, Japan's greatest fear became reality. The short war it needed became the long war it could not afford. And the question that began this story, why did Japan attack a country it knew was stronger, has one final answer. Because Japan believed that waiting meant losing, and gambling looked like the only way to change the odds. They were right about one thing. The clock was ticking. They were catastrophically wrong about who would benefit when it finally ran out.